And we are live. All right. Hello. Today is May the 8th. So we are on day 8 of Celiac Awareness Month. My name is Tracy, otherwise known as Healthy Happy Momsy. And I am here all month with some go lives to share some different facts with you guys about celiac awareness, to answer some questions. So if you find this information helpful, please feel free to share it with others. If you have topics that you want me to cover, please comment or post a comment below and ask questions. I would love to help you guys out. So a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. And then I'll share a little bit of fun stuff before we get into the good stuff for today. So my name is Tracy. I am a certified health and wellness coach. Prior to being a certified health and wellness coach, I was in pharmaceutical sales for 17 years. I feel that definitely pharma has a great way to help so many patients, so many people that are in different scenarios. But what I learned was that 10 years ago, when I was diagnosed with celiac, through actually getting my daughter diagnosed or figuring out what was going on with her, I realized that I needed to learn a lot more about nutrition. And the more that I learned, the more that I realized if we truly understood more about what we were putting in our bodies, that we would need a whole lot less of the medicines that I had sold over the years. So while I thought that the medicines and felt the medicines were very helpful for many patients, I had a burning desire that I wanted other people to be able to learn how to better take care of themselves as I did through the process. I had struggled with my weight over the years. I'd struggled with other things like migraines, chronic sinus infections, horrible allergies, which it was actually the allergies that led to the sinus infections, because they would just kind of get full-blown out of control. So anyway, but I was diagnosed in 2009 with celiac, and I've spent the last 10 years doing a ton of research on this to better understand what's going on with myself, to better understand what's going on with my daughter, and learned just from some different phases of life. She was a little over a year when we found all this out, and I was 33, 32 at the time because I was about to turn 33. So 32, 33 when I found out. So anyway, I spend a ton of time understanding this and helping people, like I said, in general with their health and wellness needs, whether they have celiac or not. I tend to help much more people because the population in general, only 1% of the population actually has celiac. But for those of us who do, it's also important to know that a lot of people who have celiac go undiagnosed. So today we're actually going to cover diagnosis. But first, I have to share this with you guys. May 8th. Some of you that have been on the different forums, you know what today is with regards to Aldi. May 8th is the day that Aldi is supposed to have all of their new gluten-free products in stock. So I have seen a few of them around here. I do live in the Greensboro, North Carolina area. And so if you have not been to Aldi, then you might want to check it out. They do tend to carry a great line of products called Live G-Free, and that helps for those of us that need to eat gluten-free and from time to time need some of those products that aren't as healthy as the other options. Naturally, gluten-free is always going to be a better option. But from time to time, you do want some treats. So the Live G-Free brand is the Aldi store brand. It is much more affordable than some of the other stores, but don't get me wrong, I love a lot of brands. But I do try to eat more of the healthy, natural foods and foods that tend to naturally be gluten-free. But I do want to still make you guys aware of all the different options available out there because everybody has different needs. So I will be going to Aldi probably today. I will report back on what I've seen. I know there's supposed to be some donuts that are coming out. I'm trying to remember what else. The cheesecake is coming back this year. There's a couple of different options that are coming out that are new. Some are just going to be for this month, and some are going to be staple items for Aldi. So anyway, the more that I can help people when it comes to their budgets and to eating healthier, I always want to try to help you do that. As a reminder, I am also paired with an amazing health and wellness company that has absolutely simplified my meal prep. I do still cook dinner most of the time from scratch. Either I do, my boyfriend does, or my daughter does. We kind of take turns. But I am partnered with an amazing nutrition company. So if you're looking for an easy way to get healthy with something that is going to provide maximum nutrients, minimum meal prep time, and also is going to help with detoxifying your body, hey, hit me up. I would love to help you out. But today's topic, like I said, Celiac Awareness Month. Today we're going to talk about testing for celiac. All right, this is important. So when it comes to officially getting diagnosed with celiac, just like everything else, you don't just go, hey, I have celiac. No, there are official tests, and there are some benefits, or rather some perspective as to why you would officially want to get diagnosed. And this is something that I've seen come up in some different forums. And I'm going to kind of interweave a little bit of my story for those of you that may not be familiar. In 2009, my daughter was getting chronic ear infections. I was concerned about her chronic ear infections. My then husband and I were concerned because ear infection number 4 is when she had or ear infection number 4 is actually when she got the tubes. So tubes, a lot of the time when your kids have ear infections and they get tubes, the ear infections tend to stop because basically anatomically things tend to be working better. But she didn't stop getting ear infections. In fact, ear infection number 6 was the doozy. That was the one that led me to, oh my gosh, I have to figure out what's going on. She had a horrible ear infection. She woke up that morning, her ear was bleeding. It wouldn't stop bleeding. It looked like she'd had an earwax explosion in her crib. I was actually supposed to be flying out later that day, and I did. It was the first time I was going to be a plane ride, not a car ride away from my daughter for my job. I had to go to Florida. So, I'm going to fly to Florida. My daughter has had yet another ear infection. But when you wake up, looks like a earwax explosion in her crib. She's crying. Her ear won't stop bleeding. And I'm thinking, I'm supposed to be getting on a plane this afternoon. And I was an absolute mess. My mommy nerves were just torn apart. So we called the ENT, told them, hey, we're on our way. They were like, well, we don't have any appointments available. I was like, no, we're coming. So we walked in. They took one look at our daughter, and they were like, okay, yeah, we're going to see you. And then when they realized, that she just couldn't calm down in the waiting room, they were like, all right, we're going to put you in a procedure room. And so they were able to get the bleeding ear to stop. She still had a horrible fever, and, but they were able to get things kind of under control enough. So we went home. Like I said, now ex-husband, my then husband, took me to the airport. I got on a plane, kind of a bit of a mess, but I was, required to go to the meeting, our annual meeting. And just, having had such a stressful day, I was like, okay, I just need to be able to calm down. And one of my friends from college, I graduated from Clemson University. One of my good friends, Rachel from college, lived close by, and she and I had plans to meet for dinner. So just to kind of calm down, I had put my phone on silent, went to dinner with Rachel and a couple of her friends. And we came out of the restaurant, and I noticed that I had 7 missed calls. And it was my boss calling to let me know that my daughter, Emmy, had had a febrile seizure, that she was at the hospital. He had received a phone call from my then husband had said, we're at the hospital. She's had a seizure, or febrile seizure, because her fever had either gone up or come down just way too fast. It triggered a seizure. And they said, she's at the hospital. She's okay. My boss had 7 kids. He's like, look, I've been through this, it's going to be fine. But get back to the hotel. We're sending you home. So I got back to the hotel. There were no flights. I lived in Eastern North Carolina at the time. We were limited on flight options. And so that was the longest night of my life. I do not know if I got any sleep. I feel like I might have dozed off for maybe 30 minutes. Got on a plane the next day. Of course, my daughter was taken to the hospital in an ambulance. And she went home that night. She and her dad went home that night. So by the time I got there, it was like the stress was sort of under control. But I was still a mess. And I thought, I remember thinking, I don't know what's going on with my daughter, but this can't happen again. Like, I've got to figure out what's triggering these ear infections. We can't go through this. My nephew so her cousin on her dad's side had actually gone down that same road with the chronic ear infections, chronic sinus infections, and they had taken his tonsils and adenoids out. When they did, they had diagnosed him with lymphoma. So I was absolutely scared that my one and only child was going to go down that same path. They did want to take her adenoids out, and I thought, let's figure out why she keeps getting ear infections. So I took her to a holistic chiropractor who works with the pediatric residents at UNC Chapel Hill, so well respected in the chiropractic community as well as in the traditional medical community. And we ended up, she said, I think she has a food intolerance. She was like, let's take gluten out for 2 weeks. We did. As soon as we gave it back to her, she had a raging yeast infection. I had read Anne Louise Gettleman's book called The Fat Flush Plan, and I remembered that Emmy had had chronic yeast infections because we knew how to recognize them because of how frequently they happened. But again, it's one of those things that I was told, like, babies just get them. And I was like, wait a second, as soon as we gave her gluten, she got a yeast infection. I remembered that's a food intolerance. So we started looking at the path of Emmy having a gluten intolerance, and made the decision together to take gluten out of her system. And then as we were learning more about it, I actually read a great article in, and I don't think this magazine's around anymore because I was trying to find it, but it's called Living Without. And it talked about symptoms of those that have problems with gluten and this diagnosis called celiac. And it talked about that a lot of people who have celiac have diarrhea, but there were other lesser known issues that were still, although they weren't as well known, they were still classic symptoms of celiac, such as constipation, migraines, chronic allergies. And those were things that rang true to me because I was like, wait a second, I've dealt with this all my life. I've been miserable, and, let me find out more about this. So when I had my annual appointment with my primary care physician, I was like, hey, there's this test I want you to run. Now, at this point, we had actually gone gluten-free in the family, and so I knew that I actually had to reintroduce gluten back in my system. I had been feeling better because I had taken the gluten out, but I knew in order to do the test that I actually had to have gluten back in my system. So I was like, yay, I get to eat all that stuff that I used to love, that I hadn't found a good gluten-free alternative. Again, 10 years ago, our options were limited. And but I started feeling cruddy again. But I knew, suck it up. And because of the genetic component, my then husband and I decided, you know what, if it turns out that I have celiac, then at least we'll know that our daughter probably has it. Once we understood what was required for celiac testing, we had agreed we didn't want her to go back through being sick again because of what had happened to her before, because of what we were concerned with as far as what could happen to her. We didn't want to put her through that. So I went for my annual blood test, and they did do the traditional blood test, which is the immunoglobulin A, the IgGA test, and because there's a couple different markers they can look for. There's IgGA, IgG. Oh goodness, I had this scrolled on the right page, and where's the other one? And then there's this DGP that I was actually not even as familiar with. And so, or there's IgA TTG. So there's a couple of different ones that they can look at. So the immunoglobulin, the transglutamin, so just scattered right now. Sorry. Anyway, so they can look for the IgG, IgA, and the TTG. So when they're looking for this, so there you go. Those are the three main that they're looking for. I just kind of looked at that backwards, trying not to cheat on my phone here, but I did pull it up for a reason. So those are the three kind of blood tests. The IgA, 98% of those with celiac will actually test positive on that test, but there's other ways that they do it. So essentially when they're trying to determine if it's celiac or not, it's usually confirmed with an endoscopy. But what happens is that with the blood marker test, that they're looking for, like I said, you have to have gluten in your system. When you have gluten in your system and you have celiac, then what happens is your body has an autoimmune response, and therefore that's what's showing up in the blood markers when they do the actual test. So you've got to have gluten in your system. If you're gluten-free and you take the test, you're most likely going to get a negative. It could be a false negative. It could be a true negative, but you're not going to have the right you're not going to have what's going on in your system necessary for that to be an accurate test. So you do have to reintroduce gluten into your system in order to take that test. Usually the next phase is to do an endoscopy. And whether you have reflux or not, the endoscopy is actually super helpful, because with the endoscopy, what that will do is it will show if there's been damage done to your small intestine. However, I was actually reading some information lately that was very informative, because when you have celiac, what happens is the villi actually get blunted, and so therefore your body does not absorb the nutrients when you're eating food. So when you're eating, you're still getting the food in your system, but you're not getting all the same nutrients that you need that a person without celiac gets. However, here's the interesting part, and I just saw some information about this recently, and I hadn't seen it before that. I will say my endoscopy was actually negative. It can go both ways for people. It can be negative, or it can be positive, and yet either way, if the person's endoscopy is positive, they have celiac. That was the former gold standard for diagnosing celiac. It was the blood test and the endoscopy. However, here's the problem with the endoscopy. It is that you're only measuring a certain part of the small intestine. You can only get so far down with the endoscopy. So there's actually been some controversy over that lately, because the question is, do we really know what's going on? Do we just accept the blood test, because then you've got the autoimmune response in there? Do we just accept that as a positive? There's a little bit of controversy. My gastroenterologist that I was going to in Eastern North Carolina, because I'd gone in and done a ton of research, that's just what I do. He said, you were right, your endoscopy is negative. And I was like, yeah, I kind of knew that. Because he said, well, it's possible you could have had reflux in your sleep. I'm like, I know that I'm not. I know my body. But because of the fact that I had done the research, he said, you know what we're going to do? He said, I do want a secondary assessment here. So he actually did the genetic testing at that point. And when the blood test came back, he said, I can't believe that you're positive. But because of the fact that you had done your research, he's like, I was willing to do the genetic testing. Now, part of the reason for doing that also is because he felt that would help with the answers that we wanted for our daughter. Because knowing that if I had the genetic markers for celiac, that definitely increased the chances of my daughter having celiac. At that point, I realized, I looked back and they had only tested for one of the genes for celiac. I have, however, since then done one of those home genetic testing, and they actually test for 2 genetics with that. And I do have both genetic markers that they tested for. And when they do that, though, here's something that you need to understand. And so, sorry, getting a little bit in depth here, but I think it's important to understand these different steps as far as, what's really a confirmed diagnosis of celiac. The genetic markers, what I've learned since then is that that's a way of ruling out celiac. Meaning, if you don't have 1 or 2 of the genetic markers, you're most likely going to not develop celiac. What they are seeing is that most patients with celiac have at least 1 or 2 of the markers. However, here's where it gets fun. Just because you have the genetic markers, that doesn't always mean that you're going to develop celiac. It means that you can't rule it out. There's still other tests that they're looked for in order to officially confirm that you have celiac, which would be like the blood test. But in order to have the blood test done, you have to have gluten back in your system. I have been hesitant because of my daughter's recent seizures that have occurred that I've shared with you guys. I'm very hesitant to put gluten back in her system on purpose on a regular basis, because she had the febrile seizure 10 years ago, and then she had another seizure March 28th, and she's been having absence seizures that we were not aware of. So at this point, I don't know that it's in her best interest to actually put her health at risk. Because of what has been going on, because I know that when she's had gluten that she has had, she's also had horrible allergies triggering again, and we don't want that developing into another sinus infection where she goes back on the antibiotic route, as I did and as she had, because it damages your gut flora when you're on antibiotics. When you need them, you need them. I'm getting into way too much of this, but guys, I think it's kind of important to know the different factors and the different steps when it comes to testing for celiac. Finally, the other part is, if your endoscopy is negative, one of the other markers that is considered a confirmed diagnosis of celiac would be dermatitis herpetiformis, to actually have that confirmed with a biopsy. And so I did actually have that confirmed a couple of years ago. And that was the dermatitis herpetiformis rash is one that looks kind of like shingles, kind of looks like chickenpox. And that is something that is seen in people who have celiac. So it is a specific rash to celiac. So the blood markers plus the endoscopy, or the blood markers plus DH, would be that classic diagnosis of celiac. And in order to look at FMLA, things like that, it is important to have the official diagnosis of celiac. If your celiac is impacting your basic work or your school functioning to have a 504, you do need an official medical diagnosis for celiac in order to get any of those accommodations. I can take a sip here, sorry. But there's also, as I said before, where my daughter kind of falls in this is, we know she has at least one of the 2 genetic markers. She initially what her diagnosis was non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And we have to decide if it's, what her health risks are as far as if we officially were to get her diagnosed. It's kind of on the fence right now. So if you are feeling symptomatic and you're thinking, okay, do I get tested? Do I not get tested? You can do a gluten washout. And if you feel better, that's great. But if you truly want answers, then get tested. Do what you need to do in order to get tested. Have this stuff back in your system. Enjoy the gluten-filled lasagnas, pastas, the ice cream that has cake and cookies. Don't go totally like hog wild, but enjoy the things that you might be giving up later or changing out later. And as far as where do you go to get tested, that is actually what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, which would be the importance of going to somebody who truly understands celiac. One of the things that I have learned in these groups is very related to this. So I will talk about that tomorrow. But I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Thank you so much. Like I said, if you have questions that you want me to address, please type them in the comments below. If you feel this is helpful, please share it with those that you think would benefit from this. And if you are looking for some amazing nutrition that I was just talking about, because I'm going to go to Aldi. We do look for the splurges. But if you're looking for a way to get healthy for something that is gluten-free, has some dairy-free options if you need that, and you want to be able to do that reset in your system, let's talk, because I am partnered with an amazing health and wellness company that I love to share, and I love watching others get healthy. And I work with a ton of people that actually don't have celiac that can have gluten. So whether you have gluten or not, that nutrition program is amazing. But anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys tomorrow at 12:30 Eastern Time. Take care.